Please join me in welcoming Dr. Erica Lam, Alex Panton Foundation Clinical Consultant, and Ms. Laila Shim, Research Analyst at the National Drug Council, who will be setting the scene with a presentation on the impact of childhood trauma on substance use and violence on the youth of the Cayman Islands. First of all, Ms. Shim will be introducing the Cayman Islands Drug Survey and followed by Dr. Lam's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another warm good morning to everybody. I'm so happy to be here today to offer an introduction into what the Cayman Islands Student Drug Use Survey, or the SISTUS for short, is before Dr. Lam really dives into what the mental health results from the 2022 survey was. So what is the SISTUS? The SISTUS is a survey that has been conducted by the NDC every 2 years since 1998 among all students that are enrolled in years 7 through 13 or grades 6 through 12 in both our public and our private schools in both Grand Cayman and Cayman Brac. The purpose of the survey is to help us track and monitor the prevalence and patterns of youth substance use over time. But this has also evolved to monitor other health indicators as well, including mental health outcomes, which was added to the survey in 2018 in partnership with the Alex Panton Foundation. It is important to note that the mental health section of the survey is only offered to our older students, so this would include those that are enrolled in years 9 through 13 or grades 8 through 12. So as a key change to the 2022 survey, this was the first cycle to actually be administered in an online format. And to our knowledge, this was also the very first time that a secondary level student drug survey has been successfully completed in an online format in the Caribbean region. So this was something that we were very excited to have accomplished in this 2022 cycle. Thank you. With the online survey, we had a total of 3,608 students that participated, and this equated to a participation rate of 83%, which is considered to be quite good for an online survey, so we were very happy to have achieved this rate. In addition to the online format, we have also significantly shortened the survey in comparison to previous years by condensing the questions into 7 different modules. And so the 5 that are up on our presentation were the 5 that were asked in the 2022 cycle. The plan is to cycle through a different set of modules each survey cycle. However, some modules will remain the same regardless of the survey year that we're in. And this will include our core demographic questions, our consumption pattern questions, and of course, our mental health questions. Okay, so that was a lot of background information on the survey. Why is it so important? Firstly, we know that young people are not the only group that use substances. However, global research shows us that young people more commonly use substances in comparison to all other age demographics. So from a public health perspective, this data not only serves to provide us with an insight into what illegal and underage drug use looks like, but it highlights areas for intervention, and it helps us to ensure that the corresponding services that are designed out of this data are appropriate and relevant for what our young people are currently experiencing when it comes to substance use and other health behaviors as well. And lastly, the survey helps monitor other health indicators, as I've alluded to earlier, that impact our youth, such as mental health, and of course, the theme of today's symposium, which is trauma. And so with that being said, I would like to welcome Dr. Erica Lam to present to you the mental health results from the 2022 survey. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Hey, so why are we talking about trauma in our Youth Mental Health Symposium? Because trauma and stress affect the development of child and its brain, mental health, and identity and functioning. According to the World Health Organization, there are 3 main factors that affect one's mental health. The first being how much stress one is exposed to. This also includes the pressure to conform with peers and exploration of their identity. Second being the imbalance of reality and future. For example, media influences and gender norms can worsen the gaps between the adolescent's reality and the perceptions or aspiration for the future. Third being adversity, which we're going to talk about a lot more today. Other important factors are the quality of the home life and relationship with peers, exposure to violence, especially sexual violence and bullying. Harsh parenting and severe and social economic problems can also influence our young people's mental health. The more risk factor the young people exposed to, the greater the potential impact on their mental health. So we talk about adversity, stress a lot when it comes to mental health. So what is trauma and how does it relate to our young people? Trauma results from exposure to events that are stressful, frightening, or distressing, has a long-lasting effect on their function, mental health, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Traumatic events include car accident, surviving a natural disaster, physical, sexual assaults, childhood trauma and neglect, living with family member with mental health or substance use disorders, sudden unexplained separation from a loved one, poverty, racism, discrimination, violence in the community, war, or terrorism. ACE is often mentioned when we talk about trauma in childhood. So what are ACEs? ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Events, which are potentially traumatic events in childhood before the age of 17 years old, such as neglect and experiencing or witnessing violence, often referred to toxic stress. A lot of the trauma specialists refer to toxic stress in childhood as developmental trauma. There's a tool to measure ACE. It's called the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Event Scale. You will hear about the results in a little moment. Toxic stress from ACE can change the brain development and affect how the body responds to stress. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, at least 5 of the top leading causes of death are associated with childhood adversity events. The higher the ACEs, the higher the risk. Globally, 1 in 6 adults, that is 16%, experience 4 or more types of ACEs. Having any ACEs is associated with an increased risk for suicide. The odds of even attempting suicide are 30 times higher for adults with 4 or more ACEs compared to adults with no ACEs. And this is our local data. More than 1 in 4.3 students reported experiencing 4 or more ACEs. That is 23%. 446 students experience 4 or more type of childhood adversity. And 10%, that's 197 students, report 3 ACEs. Let me recap on the global data. Globally speaking, 16% of the adults experience 4 or more type of ACEs. In the Cayman Islands, our young people are saying 23%. 16% global data, 23% of our local young people. The graph here shows the type of trauma reported by our young people. The highest being household challenges. That is 1,114 students said that they have been exposed to substance, mental health illnesses of their parents, divorce or separation, seeing their parents' incarceration, witness domestic violence. And this is way higher than the exposure to emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Sadly, a third of our young people said that they have been neglected either emotionally and physically. That's nearly 600 students said that they have not felt cared for by their parents or caregiver. Locally, ACEs significantly contribute to misconduct, such as e-cigarette use, being bullied, belonging to a gang, being in a fight, drunk in school, attacking someone with an intention to harm them, carrying a weapon, and binge drinking. These students are likely to continue the cycle of aggression and violence and being bullied. Most importantly, the ACEs score are also positively correlated to anxiety and depression, meaning the higher the ACEs, the higher risk of experiencing anxiety and depression. So practically the same trend with our global data. There's no coincidence that our young people are using substance, risky behavior as a way to cope of what has happened to them. And the exposure to trauma is making them vulnerable to gangs and violence. Dr. Davis will be talking about substance misuse later. So we look at the statistic. Now let's look at the how. How developmental trauma affects children. We can't talk about the development of child without understanding the brain development. This is the graph. Let me see if my pointer works. Yep. Here is the graph that shows the brain development, and this is the graph that shows the rates of the body growth. It showed that the most rapid rates of growth take place in the womb, in utero, and from birth to age 4, the brain grows exponentially, while the body continues to grow to the late 20s. It is the most malleable and vulnerable time because the experience are actively shaping and organizing the child's brain. The brain of a 4-year-old is 90% of the adult size. Experiences that take place during this window of organization have a greater potential to influence the brain, either in a positive or in negative ways. These are the neural connections of the brain. The synapses are wired together depending on the experience of the child and their environment. Providing safe, predictable, nurturing, and repetitive experience can help the child to express its full potential. But if the environment is characterized by violence and neglect, then the synapses are strengthened to those that help you to identify danger instead of those that are conducive to learning and meeting early milestones such as walking or talking. And this is how trauma impacts can actually change the structure and the function of the neural network, especially to do with regulating stress and arousal. The organization of the brain takes place from bottom up. Like a house, the foundation gets built first, then the roof. The simplest part of the brain stem, get built first, then the higher and more complex order of the brain, the cortex. All information comes through our body through sensory experiences such as touch, smell, sight, and sound, through the lower parts of the brain all the way through to the higher parts of the brain to get a response. These signals are sent to the higher part of the brain for decision-making and planning for all this function. At birth, for example, the brainstem area responsible for body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, and then the higher parts of the brain get developed for other functioning. Those basic functions must be intact for the young people, for the infant to survive. Any malfunction is immediately noticeable. The lower and more simple parts of our brains have far fewer options than the higher parts of the brain to respond. For example, flight or fight impulses. The mid parts of the brain is responsible for emotion, attachment, while the cortex parts of the brain, the higher parts, are responsible for abstract cognition, critical thinking, planning, and have years to develop before they are needed or fully functional. Each part of the brain has its own timetable to develop and has its own function. This network makes up the essential elements of the human stress responses. If anything goes wrong or not developed properly, you will see the problem in here, such as trauma response, depression affect symptoms, relational difficulties, alcohol substance misuse, or guilt or shame related to identity. In order for the brain to develop properly, we require a sequential development, which is time, pattern, repetitive behavior, experience. For example, when an infant is hungry, she's not going to raise her hand, order a glass of milk, and wait for it. What does she do? She cries, sending out a stress signal to her caregiver, who then meets her need by providing milk and providing comfort such as stroking, rocking, singing in order to calm her down. This regulating, predictable, repetitive response from the caregiver helps to reduce the physical distress, sending a rewarding signal to increase oxytocin. Over time, this teaches the baby how to deal effectively with the physical arousal without being totally dependent on the adults. The child also associates the adult with safety, trust, and love building, also secure attachment, also the trusting relationship with the world. So the daily stress that the infants face with become a source that builds their resilience, because the stress comes in are predictable, small in dose, and are controllable. Unfortunately, abuse is characterized by severe level of stress, usually for a prolonged period of time, sending a large amount of threats, and the child simply cannot predict it or have any control, hence desensitizing the stress system and making the child vulnerable, therefore creating trauma. While threats and stress desensitize the stress system, neglect is like the lack of stimulation. It's like not giving water or food to the plants. Simply, we cannot grow. The brain needs stimulation, love, connection, attention, and nurture. Not having any nurture during the first 3 years of life can result in a disorganization of the neural system. It's simply like the black hole in the brain here. The synapses and the neural network fail to develop, and this part of the brain is responsible for social, emotional functioning. Many studies found that maltreated infants show disrupted or insecure attachment. They struggle with emotional dysregulation, has a higher stress response, meaning they're easily triggered into flight or fight response. Children who experience abuse and neglect in infancy and early childhood are at greater risk for developing maladaptive behavior, mental health problems as they get older for this reason. The brain develops bottom up when abuse and neglect take place while the brain is still developing. It's like affecting its architect. The brain is either flooded with stress hormones,
and preoccupied with flight or fight, or it simply does not have the stimulation to grow, developing these gaps and holes. It's like the broken stairs in this picture. If the bottom is broken, how are we expecting to get up there? If our children experience abuse, trauma, and neglect, their brain is like this stair. They would struggle with the lower brain functioning, like sensory, stress response, relational development. How can we expect them to develop higher brain function, like planning, learning, problem solving, impulse control, or self-regulation? And how can we expect them to go into school to learn a new language, maths, or science? So trauma and neglect affect not just mental health, but the development of the child as a whole. When trauma takes place in childhood, depending the age and intensity, it will affect the function of the brain. These are the 7 main areas that developmental trauma will contribute to. Throughout today's presentation, you will hear how trauma and neglect affects this functioning. Ms. Shannon will talk about how generational trauma affects our identity and self-concept and society as a whole. Dr. Edwards will talk about how trauma looks like in a student, in a classroom, and how that impacts on their learning later this afternoon. Now, let's look back at the local data and what does our young people say? This year, we used the short R-card, which is a short self-report questionnaire for children, adolescents aged 8 to 18 that measure broad anxiety through 15 items and major mood disorder through the criteria according to the DSM-5. This graph here shows the percentage of students who score in border range, meaning that they experience the symptoms but not severe enough that they will meet the clinical cutoff in each of the commonly diagnosed disorder. The highest being generalized anxiety disorder, meaning worrying and ruminating on their worries, followed by panic disorder, separation anxiety disorder, then depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and social phobia. This is a very interesting graph for our clinician, I'm sure, because this graph shows the percentage of students who would actually meet the clinical threshold for this disorder. In 2022, surprisingly, no student would meet the criteria of social anxiety according to our results of the questionnaire. This is good news because social withdrawal can exacerbate isolation and loneliness. Maybe something to do with the pandemic, where students want more social connection while they're still experiencing the symptoms of social anxiety. Maybe they are not so to the point where they're isolating themselves. But 6.5% of the students would meet the clinical diagnosis of panic disorder. The next highest being the diagnosis of separation anxiety, followed by generalized anxiety disorder, then OCD and depression. We have about 4.6% of the young people meeting the criteria of depression. This is still worrying because depression can lead to suicide, and that we know anxiety and depression disorder can profoundly affect school attendance and schoolwork. Globally, 1 in 7 young people experience mental health disorder. Depression, anxiety, behavioral disorder are the leading causes of illnesses and disabilities in adolescents. Specifically, it is estimated that about 3% of the 10 to 14 years old and 4% of the 15 to 19 years old experience anxiety disorder globally. in the Cayman Islands, we have over 4.4 to 6.5% of our young people between the age of 13 to 18 years old meeting clinical diagnosis of anxiety. So our data are a lot higher than the global data. The heartbreaking fact is that depression is estimated amounts 1% of our adolescents globally, and about 3% in the age of 15 to 19 years old. In the Cayman Islands, there is 4.6% of our students meeting clinical threshold of depression in the age group of 13 to 18 years old. This is nearly double the amount in comparison to global data. This compared the score that meets the clinical cutoff in 2020 before the pandemic and in 2022 after the pandemic isolation. There's a reduction in social anxiety from 5.6% to 0. Also a reduction in generalized anxiety disorder and OCD. However, there is an increase in panic disorder, separation anxiety, and depression. Locally, being female and having higher ACEs are the significant predictor of anxiety and depression, along with bullying, exposed to life-threatening events, being involved in violence, witnessed aggression or violence, or being drunk in school, or being in a fight. So all of those are significant risk factors to our young people locally. We will recap on the data of suicide and self-harm and look at the data on our risk factor that contribute to suicide and self-harm locally. In 2020, 27.4% of our students said that they have engaged in self-harming behavior. That's 626 students engaging in self-harm, cutting being the most popular method. In 2020, the prevalence of actual attempted suicide was close to 9% overall. That's 202 students said that they have tried to end their lives. According to the World Health Organization, suicide is the fourth leading cause of death in the age group of 15 to 19 years old. The risk factors associated with suicide are multifaceted and include harmful use of alcohol, abuse in childhood, stigma against seeking help, barrier to access care, and access to means of suicide. Digital media, like any other media, can play a significant role in either enhancing or weakening suicide prevention efforts. Here are the local data collected from our students showing us their risk factors. Over 40% of the students use alcohol in a harmful way. The more common reason against seeking help is the fear of judgment and embarrassment. And some of young people simply don't know where and how to ask for help. In 2020, 40% of our students said they will use an app or social media to help them to seek help. So now let's look at this data through the lens of trauma. This is a simple polyphagal theory. It shows that when a young child is faced with threats or high level of stress, these are their response. They restore to primitive coping mechanism either flight, fight, or freeze, or they simply shut down because it's too much. The hyperarousal response include running away, hitting, screaming, saying hurtful things as a way to get people away from them or get away from the stress. There's changes in physiological symptoms in their body like heart rates, shaky, sweating. When fighting, running away, and freeze don't help them, what do? They shut down. This activates the hypoarousal system, such as going numb, zoning out, stop thinking, shutting down the digestive system. Over time, this survival mechanism develop into mental health difficulties, such as the hypoarousal will develop into anxiety disorder, anger, emotional flooding, digestive problems. The hypoarousal would develop into depression, fatigue, disassociation, and pain. And Mr. Brandon will talk about pain in relation to trauma later. The child then trapped in this survival loop, even when there is no actual danger. Their brain can't tell from the normal cue. Signal comes into the lower parts of the brain, just trigger a stress response, stopping them getting nurture or analyzing the information using the smart parts of the brain. And all they see is danger and constantly fighting with themselves and the world. This is kind of what happened with children who got removed from home due to abuse and trauma or neglect. Even when they're placed in foster home or care home, they're still reliving their trauma day to day. I can see some of my colleagues from the Keys Foundation and NCVO here, and they are the care worker who are doing the hard work taking care of our children who are faced and trapped in this survival loop. Over time, a traumatized child grows into a traumatized person. Their body and mind carry the scars. It is not nice to live like that. So what do? How many of us, after a stressful day, would enjoy a drink? Or just put the gas down a little bit faster on our way home? Smoke or binge drink or binge eat on salty, sweet, or fatty food just to feel a little bit better after a long, stressful day. Right? Yeah, I see a few nods, yeah. Well, because that's what your brain need that reward system to get that balance. And this is what our young people are doing. They're taking risk to make themselves feel better, to manage their stress. Many risk-taking behaviors, such as substance use or sexual risk-taking, start during adolescence. Risk-taking behavior can be an unhelpful strategy to cope with emotional difficulties and can severely impact on the adolescent's mental health, physical well-being. The use of tobacco and alcohol are an additional concern to health. Cannabis being the most widely used drugs amongst our young people. Perpetration to violence is a risk-taking behavior that can increase the likelihood of lower educational attainment, injury, involvement with crime, or death. Interpersonal violence was ranked amongst the leading cause of death of older adolescents boys in 2019 worldwide. In the Cayman Islands, 41% of our students said that they use alcohol. Nearly a third of them use e-cigarettes, 6% of our students use marijuana, 11% use binge drinking, 4% smoke cigarettes. Worldwide, the prevalence of heavy episodic drinking among adolescents was about 13.6%, with male being more at risk. In the Cayman Islands, we have 10% of the students use alcohol. There's a significant reduction since 2020, which I think is very, very interesting. In 2022, there was an increase of carrying weapons in our community from 12.5% in 2020 to 23.4%, more boys than girls. 1 in 8 students said that they had attacked someone with an intention to cause serious harm. Significantly more in boys in comparison to girls, and there is definitely an increase since 2020. There has been a significant increase of reporting fighting in boys in 2022 than 2020. We have been looking at this data through a trauma lens, not just what is wrong with you, but what had happened to you. So when we ask our students of how much violence have you been exposed to, this is what our young people said. Post-pandemic, there has been a significant increase in the exposure to violence. So there's no coincidence that we have such an increase in 2020 in misconduct if our young people has been exposed to more violence. Most students have witnessed this in school and in our community, and third took place in their home. Overall, a small portion of the students said that they have been arrested in 2022, boys being more significant than girls. Another risk factor that's more prominent in boys is belonging to a gang, almost double since 2020. Overall, 12% of our students got suspended because of violence in school. The data on bullying has been consistent but heartbreaking. Over half of the students in Cayman Islands have experienced bullying. We know that bullying is one of the main risk factors of mental health. Again, we want to know what had happened to this student. We found that students who were bullied were more likely to have attacked someone with an intention to cause serious harm compared to those who were not bullied. So our students are acting out what they have experienced. We're going to quickly do the comparison data. There's a significant factors in our boys. Basically, our boys are more likely to use externalized behavior. Our girls are more likely to internalize their difficulties and have mental health disorder. The grade data is quite interesting. It shows that the younger students have a more significant risk factor related to misconduct, and grade 11 students show more mental health difficulties. So we can look at the data in two ways. Either that the students who show more misconduct don't make it to grade 11 because of suspension, or that they do develop more mental health problems later on in life. When we look at the ACEs according to grade, it's kind of correlate with the risk factor. The higher reporting of ACEs in grade 10 and higher risk factor in grade 10. And these are the data according to location. East End, Northside, and Cayman Brac show more risk factors than Georgetown and Bordentown. And I think this is really worth looking with our local policy maker. Interestingly, Northside, East End, and Cayman Brac also show higher mean of score in ACEs. So what are we saying? Our young people are suffering with a great deal of trauma and emotional difficulties. They're acting out as a way to cope. We need to shift from what is wrong with you to what had happened to you. Building a trauma-informed community and start healing the scar and trauma of our community and stop the epigenetic and intergenerational trauma. If we want to build a strong workforce, we really need to start looking at promotion and prevention of mental health. We need to invest in mental health promotion, strengthening the individual capacity to regulate emotion, enhance alternative to risk-taking behavior. Criminalizing or the punitive hardcore punishment is not the way to go. We're simply going to traumatize and re-traumatize our young people who are already very traumatized. Build resilience for managing difficult situations and adversity, promote supportive social environments and network. If we want to have a healthy community, strong workforce, we need to start healing the scar and trauma and work towards resilience. And this takes form in digital media, health and social setting, and the collaboration with school and community. Ms. Lisette is going to talk about what APF is doing in collaboration with our community later this afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. I'm very aware how distressing some of these data are. Please take care of yourself. There are some tips coming up to take care of yourself, and some of our clinicians are out there to have a chat with you if you would like. Thank you.